Good morning and welcome to our fourth week continuing Introduction to Humanities under conditions of quarantine. I know that many of you have been actively engaging the questions that I've raised about the ways in which the pandemic pushes us to reflect more deeply on what it means to be human, the central question of the course. I know some of you have also been struggling a little bit with the very focused reflection on the pandemic, which understandably for all of us, I think, is itself profoundly stressful. So I wanted to share with you again a little bit my thinking in taking this approach, and then tell you a little bit more about what I envision from here going forward. Continuing the class under these conditions was always going to be a challenge. Not because necessarily of the online modality itself. I've taught quite a bit online and have done so very successfully, but not in classes where the students had not chosen an online modality. And also, the question of design, the question of the way a class is structured is very different face-to-face and online. One of the things that I like to do face-to-face, and really what we spent most of our time doing when we were together during the first half of the semester, was going through texts and other cultural artifacts together, one-on-one, Socratically, going line by line, and actually teasing out the meaning of those texts. And I find that much more difficult to do in an online modality. And so it seemed to me that the best thing to do was to shift to the text that we had been handed, the text that we were all living, the text that we share, which is the text of the pandemic itself, which raises very fundamental questions about what it means to be human, which raises very fundamental questions about where we are as a society, and which offers us an opportunity to, in many ways, explore these same specific questions that we would have been exploring had the course continued as originally planned. That said, I think that we now have a basis in some social analysis, some analysis of how our society is responding to the pandemic. And I want to begin to pull back a little bit and zero in on what has always been the core question of the course, which is what it means to be human. So this week, we are going to look at the question of work, and it is, of course, an aspect of life that has in many ways been disrupted and transformed by the pandemic. And we're going to continue our look at Marx's theory of alienated labor, and also look at Max Weber's analysis of the role of the Protestant ethic in the development of capitalism. Again, I have in the eCampus shell, in the sections that cover the original organization of the course, these two texts, and you're welcome to look at them and engage them there. But they are quite challenging, and I have also posted a couple of videos which give kind of a quick and dirty, not always entirely accurate, but I think meaningful capsule summary of these ideas. So the question really is this: the whole of the modern world is articulated around the idea that we are what we do, that the meaning of our life consists in what we accomplish in this world. And that is a perspective that in many ways is shared both by advocates of the dominant social system that has existed for the past 500 years roughly, namely capitalism, and critics of that system. People who argue that capitalism holds back the full development of human social capacities. And that's the question that we were looking at last week, is the debate between those two views. But this week, I want to get a little bit more into what they share and the differences in the way in which they understand the significance, the meaning of our interworldly activity. And so we already discussed last week the idea that for Marx, it is our creative capacity which makes us human. For Marx, human beings are defined by their capacity to bring into being new and more complex forms of organization. Plants reproduce and make plants. Dogs reproduce and make dogs. Human beings, of course, reproduce and make new human beings, but even when we are doing that, we cultivate and nurture human beings who end up being new and different, being something hopefully more than we were ourselves. And of course, we bring into being entirely new forms of technology and social organization and art. And so for Marx, this is the very core of what it means to be human. And the problem with capitalism, as we noted last week, is that because the vast majority of people are forced to sell their labor power in order to survive, we become alienated from our authentic nature. We see work as a burden. We see work as a crushing necessity. We see work as simply a means of enriching someone else. We see work as a means to consumption if we're lucky enough to have a job that allows us to make enough money to consume actively. But we lose sight, really, of what it means to be human. A little bit later than Marx, Marx did most of his work in roughly the middle of the 19th century. The beginning part of the 20th century, another sociologist, Max Weber, began exploring the question of the development of capitalism, and he didn't reject all of Marx's analysis by any means, but he noticed that capitalism had developed in certain very specific cultural contexts, particularly those contexts which were dominated by a particular type of Protestantism, namely Calvinism. And although there are a lot of churches around today, certainly, especially in the United States, which is certainly the most historically Calvinist country on the planet, they don't always identify very publicly that way. But Presbyterian churches, Reformed churches, congregational churches, all derive in some significant measure from that Calvinist tradition. And in a more moderate way, and with many people dissenting, there's a very strong Calvinist element in the Anglican tradition, the Church of England as well. So Weber went about looking at these underlying religious currents and said, well, what is it about this religion that seems to help catalyze capitalist development? And we came up with is this. He said, first of all, there was a shift that occurred in the Reformation generally, a shift from a focus on attaining otherworldly salvation by means of as pure a specifically religious vocation as possible. In a Catholic context, that would have meant entering a cloistered monastery or convent. To a focus on the idea that all work is holy, all work is sacred because it serves other human beings, because it is in a certain sense an expression of God's love for us. And that, he said, was characteristic of the Reformation as a whole. And he shows that by drawing texts from Luther and other of the key reformers. Calvinism, however, takes it one step further. Specifically, it adds the idea of what's called double predestination. And this is the idea that God has chosen certain people before the foundation of the world to be saved, and everybody else by implication at least, is condemned to eternal damnation. And there's nothing we can do about it. God does this for his own reasons. It's not based on any foreknowledge of our merit, not based on any foreknowledge of what kind of human beings we're going to be. It is based on God's own mysterious reasons. But the Calvinists also taught that there are certain signs that someone is a person who is among what they call the elect, the saved. And these signs included hard work, savings, and investment. So if you were someone who worked hard, who dedicated your entire life as purely as possible to productivity, then there was a chance at least that you might be among the saved. If you didn't, if you were a lazy lout, just like to lie on the couch and drink beer, then you're probably going downstairs. If, however, your productive activity was devoted to your own needs, survival, consumption, luxury, even to taking care of your family, that would probably be a sign that you were not among the elect. So it was those who produced more and more and saved more and more who were considered to be most likely among the elect. And then among those, the people who simply continued reinvesting. So if you're saving up for a good retirement, if you're saving up so you can relax and spend time with your grandkids, you're going downstairs. Okay? And so what Weber really did was to chart this idea, this practice of the accumulation of capital as an end in itself, of productivity as the fundamental goal. And what Weber argues is that over time, the religious underpinnings of this drop away, and we are left with this idea in a more secular context, the contemporary context, that the value of a human being is based entirely on their productivity, their savings, and their return on investment. And he argues that this is precisely the kind of person that capitalism requires. And then he goes into some fine tuning and looks at which specific variations of the doctrine tended to produce capitalists and which produced middle managers and which produced line workers. But the overall, the message is basically the same. And so it's interesting reflecting on this because putting this text side by side with Marx's writings in the Paris manuscripts on alienated labor does two things. First of all, it does identify something that is shared by all of modernity, right? And that is the idea that human life is about what we do in this world. It's about our work. But it also highlights a fundamental difference between the socialist and the capitalist variants of this modern ideal. For Marx, when Marx says that to be human is to work, that we are what we do, he's essentially saying that human beings are fundamentally creative capacity and that it is the creativity itself which is of value. And that's why, in spite of all of the kind of collectivist deformations in the Marxist tradition, the history of repression and actually existing socialism, at its core, Marx's vision of humanity is very much in line with the earlier liberal tradition, which attempted to unleash a rationally autonomous humanity, and in many ways at least resonates with earlier forms of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, that were rooted in the idea of humanity as a participation in the creative life of God. And it's just that for Marx, this is not something that God has and we lack. This is something that is, again, as we said last time, an emergent property of the universe, and we are its most advanced expression. For capitalism, on the other hand, the ideal is not the expression of some underlying creativity, some underlying participation in the creative power of being as such. The ideal essentially is pure submission, pure instrumentalization. And so when a worker works inspired by the Protestant ethic or its secular analogs, they are not aspiring to self-expression. They are not aspiring to creativity. What they're aspiring to is to be a perfect instrument. If they are still actually Calvinists, a perfect instrument in the hands of God, if they live as most people today do, a much more secularized version of that vision, a perfect instrument in the hands of capital, a perfect tool of the marketplace. So what I'd like to ask you to reflect on this week, and again, it does connect in a very profound way with the issues the pandemic has put on the table, because our work has in various ways and in different ways been interrupted. Where do you stand on this question? Is life fundamentally about what we do? Are human beings what we accomplish in life? Or is there something more? If our inner worldly activity, our activity in this life, is fundamentally the core of our humanity, perhaps the totality of our humanity, then to what should we aspire? Should we aspire to liberate our creative capacity, even if that means needing to participate in a very protracted struggle to restructure the society so that it supports that creative development? Or is it simply a matter of being the perfect instrument, the tool of capital, the tool of the marketplace? Then as we move on next week, I'm going to fold in a couple of the shorter meetings that I had hoped we would do when we were following the class together, and look at some alternatives, some other perspectives from other civilizations that suggest a very different view of what it means to be human. And so I think by the end of the course, we will in fact be circling around to that question that drives the course from its beginning, and the question that you'll be reflecting on in your final paper, namely, what does it mean to be human? And how do you intend to act on that? I still haven't decided exactly how I'm going to modify and flesh out and reframe that final assignment, those final two assignments really. I will probably package them as one, but I may keep them separate. But I'll be getting something posted for you on that this week. As always, I hope that you're safe and well, that you're taking care of yourselves, that you're taking care to the best of your ability of your families, and if you are in a position to do so, of the communities of which you're a part. Do let me know if there's anything you need, and do the best you can to follow on with these reflections, but also understand that I realize that at this juncture, there may well be other things that are a higher priority, that are more nearly absorbing your attention. The videos will be there long after the course is over, so if you're the kind of person who prefers to reflect from a distance, that will be an option for you as well. Thank you so much.